Thank you very much, Jamie, for that kind introduction. As we were wrestling here with the slide set, it reminded me that we often want to think of the view of the end. You want to go where you want to be, where you want to go, and then you work toward that goal. And so you can see at the end we'll have some questions. There's time for questions. It is good to be here. It has been an exciting year, and it's been a year that is really very few of us get a chance to see a new crop come into a state or into a country and to begin developing and growing and seeing what that crop is going to do. It's an exciting time. It's also challenging, very challenging. So I want to go ahead and look briefly at 2019. I think many of you recognize some of this data. We had over 100 plus growers. We ended up having actually about 250 by the time you consider sub-licenses and some of the interior grows and things like that, or inside grows. We had about 5,000 acres planned, and as you saw earlier, I think it was 5,300 is the number that's been used. We estimated that we had about 3,500 acres that were actually planted. Those of you who are actively engaged with farming this year know that this was a very difficult year with regard to the rains, the timing, and all of that. It was very difficult. And so we ended up with somewhat less acreage planted concerned with what was planned. Within our agency, within our organization, we looked at 2,386 acres that we actually inspected. And so that's, of those 3,500 acres, we actually were able to inspect 2,300, about 2/3 of what was grown, we believe, is what we've looked at. Out of those, we had about 81% pass without any problem, meeting the 0.3%. And we had about 400 acres, 445 acres, that exceeded the 0.3%. And so some of those were able to be retrieved, some were not. All right, so what did some of the data show about THC? This is a huge discussion. And again, what I'm sharing with you is very preliminary. We can't draw too many hard decisions on this or conclusions, but it is kind of the trend, and this is the data. Now that's an impossible slide to read. I recognize that. Don't worry about it, all right? But what it is showing is information that we'll be sharing with folks here. I think Marguerite, maybe yesterday in her presentation, may have done some sharing of varieties. But this is an overview of the varieties that were planted in Indiana this past year. So that's on the bottom here. Those are the names. And again, don't worry about this. You can't read them right now. That's not important for right now. But what is important is you look at the average, and again, note that that's average THC. So that means each one of these points may represent one or more. If only one person grew that one variety, then it's just one sample, obviously, all right? But some of these samples, we had 10, 15, 20, 30 people or more planting that, or growing that same variety. So those were average for that variety. Well, the important thing is that when you look at this line, right about here is where the 0.3% line should be, is right in this area. So that means that these other varieties to the right exceeded 0.3%. And in fact, what we see here is this for an average of 2. We had several crops that even went well above that. So again, as you're looking at this data, what that says then is that different varieties produce different amounts of THC, all right? That's no shocker. And it says that these varieties are ones that will be probably looked at for next year as being potentially low THC. We can't guarantee that, but that's based on this year's data. And then if you're looking at any of these up in this range, you should be looking at them with a tremendous amount of viewing and perspective and sampling of your crop. Make sure that you're out there looking at the crop, watching for that THC level, and know when to pull the crop, because if it, based on the new USDA regulations, that exceedance of 0.3 is very, very tight, and it's intentionally tight under the federal law. So you're going to have to be especially diligent about watching for that THC level. That is total THC, as Justin was just talking about. So those are, that's one view of the data. Another shot that kind of makes an interesting point in my mind is that if we look at THC, this is average THC by collection date. So our inspectors go out and they take samples across the state, different days. Many of you requested samples, and we took those. And so we go out, and in any one day, some days you might collect just one sample, but on other days, our inspectors may collect multiple samples, all right? So these are averages on that day. It's not the same variety. You might have 2 or 3 different varieties that you're sampling on one given day, all right? Now, 0.3% is our target level, all right? And what that shows up is this bottom line here. That's 0.3. Excuse me, that's 0.2. So between this and this, between those two, that's 0.3. So again, what that says is you would expect maybe in a variety, we would all maybe like to say, well, during the growing season, THC increases with the growth of the plant. We get that. That makes sense. And you might expect a trend line that would go like that. Okay? So why are we seeing this? Well, I think, again, we're seeing this just because of the same slide we had before. On any given day, the varieties develop more quickly than others. Some varieties develop more quickly than others, and they'll hit that THC more quickly than another variety. So actually, in our first data point, we have 0.51 was the average for that day. That's already an exceedance at the beginning of August. All right? The point I want to leave with you is you need to know your varieties. You need to check for good genetics, and you need to monitor the crop closely, looking for total THC. So the game that most of you will play if you're looking at CBD will be you want the highest CBD, but you also want to keep the THC low. And we'll talk about that this next slide. This is from Wisconsin data, and many of you may have seen this. This is published on their website, so you can get to it. If you're a science geek, you know that this line is like impossibly correlated. You know, this is a really amazing correlation. And what it says is that the upper axis here is your THC level. This is your CBD level, all right? And so what it's saying is as your CBD level increases, your THC is creating right along with it. It's on the same track, all right? This idea that we've heard discussed of, you know, well, we thought that if you had high CBD that you'd have low THC, doesn't seem to be holding. Our data looks the same, very much the same way as what this data is showing, that it tracks very closely with what the CBD is doing. Again, if you're then targeting a high CBD product that you're wanting to grow, be alert that there's also going to be a corresponding rapid increase in THC in that genetics, in that variety. And again, it needs to be monitored very closely. I think that in that first slide, if we go back to that first slide, I would really be very cautious about certainly anything in this category, I think is something you'd want to think 2, 3, 4 times about before you get into that. I would simply walk away from most of those varieties. And then, again, these will take high management. These will be safer, but will still require management. There is no variety up here that you can just plant and not test. You have to monitor the crop very closely, all right? All right, that's one of the points that we wanted to get across, and you'll see that coming up here in the next section. So based on what happened in 2019, what's happened in years preceding, what are some things that we might say are good recommendations? First, we wanted to go ahead and say that have a buyer for the crop before a crop is planted. Now, why would I say that? Well, the reason is that we aren't at a point yet with this crop where that one can grow it and just have a market for it. It doesn't exist yet. We're still lacking the infrastructure. We're still lacking the demand for commodities that can be used with or can be developed through this crop. And so growing a crop without having a contract is a huge gamble at this time. So we're encouraging folks to make sure that you have a buyer. Know exactly, you should be talking to somebody and say, hey, I'd really like to grow acres. I've got 300 acres. You're talking to a guy and he says, you know what? Well, I need some acreage planted. And by the way, I only need 50 acres. All right. Well, you've got 250 extra acres that you could do. What are you going to do with it? Do you plant it? Well, I personally would suggest that you think about getting that contracted as well. If you can only have contracts for 50 acres, grow 50 acres. Now, in the future, just like with corn and soybeans, that may not be always the case. But for right now, it's something we really need to consider seriously. Know the purpose and the hemp variety the buyer wants. So in other words, if you're growing for fiber, that's one set of plants that you're going to look at, one set of varieties. If you're wanting to grow for CBD, that's a whole nother kind of genetics and a whole different set of plants and varieties. And again, a processor may actually have, I only work with these 2 or 3 varieties, and he'll tell you what those 2 or 3 varieties are. You need to grow one of those varieties to meet that grower's or buyer's contract, all right? This would be true also for the idea of clones. Then select a variety that does not tend to run hot. And again, working with Marguerite and others, we'll go ahead and be putting out a list of just our data. We aren't in a position really to make recommendations. We've got only 1 year of data. So we're going to have to go ahead and say, this is what we know happened in 2019. And next year, at the end of the year, we'll be able to say, this is what happened in 2019 and 2020. But it's going to be building. And the point is, it takes years to build that knowledge. We do not have the same knowledge right now on hemp that they have like in corn and soybeans. Corn and soybeans, you can pretty well tailor based on your soils and climate and all those things and get a good crop and do the messaging. We're not quite there yet on hemp. It'll be several years yet. All right. Other advisories. Establish a contract with a qualified laboratory to monitor the crop. This is for total THC. So you need to know who's going to do your testing, who's a competent laboratory. We will be working with, under the USDA law, we'll be going ahead and hopefully registering laboratories who can provide that service in the state. We will post those in the state when they get licensed and ready. One of the hurdles for them is going to be that the laboratories will need to go ahead and have a DEA Schedule I license in order to operate as a USDA certifying laboratory. Don't invest more than the grower can afford to lose. And this is something I know that's been worked with, communicated very much within the organization. It's still early to know about the crop. And so we need to go ahead and invest wisely. It's just a simple statement. That's all that's intended. Go ahead and look at what you can do and learn how to grow this crop. And as your experience improves, then go ahead and certainly look at increasing your growing capability. Be accurate with reporting in decimal GPS format the location of your fields. This was a huge issue this last year. Many people weren't familiar with decimal formats GPS. It's understandable. Others were changing fields a lot and just didn't get things reported. And so, and then we had others that were reporting and doing a good job of getting it reported, but it really, Don and his group handled hundreds and hundreds of calls as fields were being changed. And so I think this next year we have a hope of getting that actually done in a web-based system so that it'll be easier to report. All right, the interim rule, we could spend, we could spend the whole time this morning on this, but I'm going to try to give you just 3 or 4 points, and if I missed your favorite point, I apologize. I'm not trying to avoid anything here, but these are some of the big program points that come to mind. The analysis of THC, as was brought out here earlier, is based on total THC, and that's an important concept, and for several different reasons. But when you talk to a laboratory about doing laboratory testing, you'll need to make sure that they understand that you're talking about total THC, both THC and THCA. The federal threshold for determination of marijuana is any valuation of THC in which the measurement of uncertainty exceeds and does not include 0.3%. Above this level, the crop must be destroyed under the federal USDA law. And what that says is that there's a calculation that laboratories do, something that's called analytical variance. Some of you may have heard of that, but this measurement of uncertainty deals with that. And so if you have a range that goes from like 0.29 up to 3.4, 3.5, something like that. Excuse me, 0.35, make sure. Then that would be acceptable under USDA law because that point includes the 0.3 or something below, all right? But if you have a crop and your analytical variance or measurement of uncertainty is 0.32 to 0.37, that does not include the 0.3, and that would be a prohibited crop. That would be marijuana according to the USDA regulations right now. So there's going to be a lot of learning on that. I think as we work through this, there'll be a lot of need to communicate, a lot of need to make sure that folks are doing the testing they need to do to stay in compliance with the new regulation. All right. And again, it's critical that we go ahead and engage in laboratory testing for THC and have preparations for taking down a crop based on total THC. Otherwise, you're going to risk the crop. And that's a hard place to be. I don't like making that statement, but that's kind of where the law is. All right, a few other observations. Crop destruction must be processed according to strict DEA requirements. This is something that a lot of states are commenting on because what it says is not only do you have to destroy the crop, but you have to have 2 people there observing it, signing off, doing the documentation, knowing exactly how many plants were involved, how many plants were destroyed, that what, all of this. And there's a lot of paperwork and time that goes with the current compliance. So that's going to be a big issue that not only for you folks, but also for state agencies, not just Indiana, but others. All right. USDA background checks appear to be federal, not just states. They will be requiring fingerprints, which would be a different setup, and we're working on that now, trying to figure out how that's going to work here in Indiana. So if I had a final answer for you, I'd give it to you, but right now we're still working through that with USDA. All right, what is a clone and why is it important to know? I think you had a session on that last well, I guess yesterday, right? So you've been through the clones. Basically, a clone is something that isn't based on seed. It's an asexual propagation. And so it's really important, the idea of having a 5 seeds producing 5 different plants to become your mother plants. It would be true that each of the derivatives from each one of those plants would be a clone, but the 5 are not equivalent. And so I won't get into that much more, but hopefully the session yesterday addressed that. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in the days ahead. Okay, next steps, and I'll try to get down those. We've obtained DEA Schedule I registration for our lab, so we're now compliant with that. We've enhanced our laboratory capacitance, including dryers. We're going to try to speed up our laboratory processes. We've hired an additional inspector, and we're looking at hiring an additional laboratory person to handle all the samples. Software purchases and build-outs are likely not serviceable until April. And this is a huge issue for surrounding states as well. Most states will have to go ahead and go through an RFP process, select a vendor, then have the vendor meet the specifications, and then install the software. And all of that can take a lot of time in the state system. And so we are working through that now, as are other states. Okay. The presentation yesterday at this meeting by Sarah on pesticides. Again, she gave a good overview. There are no Section 3 labels currently available for hemp, and that's an issue. There are products that we have on our website that you can use or that can be used, but the efficacy of many of those products is not what one would hope for. And EPA, we are working closely with EPA on getting those new products registered. They have some supposedly in the pipeline, but hopefully that will go ahead and eventually turn up as a labeled pesticide for use in the future. All right. We'll be starting, this is an important announcement here, that we'll be starting 2020 as a research year. There are a number of reasons for that. One is the law allows us to. The federal law really isn't in place yet, even with the proposed interim rule. So this allows you folks to go ahead beginning seed and doing those orders as soon as you've got a license. That'll be good. It will require researchers. It will require a written research proposal, just as we did last year. It'll require a buyer-seller agreement, as we've talked about here. I think that'll be something a little different. And then the new licenses may be granted for licensing contributing to infrastructure, and things like laboratories and others. So we'll be trying to include that. We'll be putting more information out on this in the near future. All right, here are some reasons for why we're looking at it, and one is the lateness of USDA's announcement. It was October 31st that it was officially published, the CFRs. New USDA requirements for reporting various data are significant, and most of that's driven in terms of software, so we'll need to get that in place. And we can go through. I realize we're almost out of time, so I'm trying to get through here for a few questions. Next meeting will be announced soon for the Indiana Hemp Advisory Committee. We'll be talking there then about the rules and emergency order and the processes in more detail. There will be a parallel permanent rule process that will probably take place a little bit staggered. And during that process, there will be, again, full opportunity for public comment and public meetings, and we'll be announcing all of those in advance. The state plan is to be submitted to USDA by December 31st. The emergency rule does allow us to have a rule in place. So we'll be looking at the USDA rule, make sure we've got those pieces in place, and then can go forward. And then the final comments on USDA rules are December 30th, and we do not think that USDA will have final conclusions by December 31st. I don't think that's going to happen. So, all right. Personal take-homes for 2019, and I think we're probably getting down to the last minute or two. There's much to be learned about growing hemp in Indiana. Learning can be very expensive. Needs to see that this crop is a cautious investment. It's nothing about hemp right now is really guaranteed. And so that needs to be taken into your business considerations. We're learning about farming hemp, about performance. We're also learning from other states. We're learning from each other, meetings like this. So if you have folks that you know that are going to be involved in growing hemp and want to get involved, encourage them to get involved with organizations and start asking questions and learn. We do need more infrastructure. With infrastructure becomes a lot more viability and a lot more demand, a lot more ability to handle crop. And we need to closely manage every part of the hemp from growing to monitoring, processing, marketing, and investing. All right. We have time for just a few questions. How am I doing time-wise? Good. All right. Yes. Yes. Hi.
We know that there's not really certified seed available,
Right.
but we also know that a lot of the varieties is much more stable, more
Right.
closer to almost being certified. In your data results, you showed a lot of variation on the varieties. Did you distinguish between those that were grown from clones and those that were currently grown from seed?
We did, I think everyone heard the question. We did not distinguish clones from seed. That's something that we will do probably as a later analysis. But this was very preliminary, like this is coming off the fields. But yes, that is a good question. That's something we'd want to know, because that would be important to communicate.
Do you know of those crops, how much was clone and how much was seed acreage-wise?
I don't, Don's saying we don't know.
We have the data, but we haven't parsed it yet.
Right. Yes, Don was saying that we've got the data in terms of a report, but we haven't parsed the data yet. Yes.
Yes, question on cultivars, and have the genomes of those cultivars been sequenced and made public? Of course, that's still to be done. Main reason being, is there any way yet to correlate at the genomic level the output characteristics, THC, fiber, oil, and so forth? And is that to be done, or has Purdue already sequenced a lot of those genomes?
No, that's something that needs to be done. There is some of that has been done, but for the most part, that has not been done. So this year we had a lot of issues with even labeling seed correctly and properly naming and identifying it, so that some seed that was, I'll say is Bob's best, was also being sold as Fred's best. All right, it's the same thing. And so there was a lot of that went on, and so we've got a lot of learning to do, and a lot of that could be resolved by genotyping and by comparison of a genotype library.
Does Purdue have that capability to do, or is that going to be a private sector?
That will likely be a private sector activity. Any other questions?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Hey, on that testing that was portrayed on there, was that just testing that was the initial testing, or was that any retesting data?
That, I believe, included, I'm sorry? It included retesting.
Okay, just give an example. So we had a cultivar called Mammoth that was hot at the initial testing, but whenever you got the retest, it came back low. So I just didn't know, it kind of seemed like that was still high on there as far as that went. But just wanted to double check on that, because I don't know necessarily if it was like a fair representation of all cultivars that, may have tested hot initially, but then when retested a different method, came back a different way, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, we've, like I said, this is preliminary data, and you can't draw too many hard conclusions on it.
Gotcha, okay, I appreciate that, thank you.
Hello, it's on that graph that was represented earlier.
Oh, okay, there we go,
On the
sorry.
graph that was represented earlier, is there any indication of when those plants
There was a large amount of variance. No, I don't know how long they'd been out in the field. That's really what your question is, right? Right. And no, we don't have the days that were associated with those plantings.
The second part of the question is there an interactive or a live map that shows the different fields where we could look at and kind of share to prevent crossbreeding or pollinating or anything like that?
There is not. There's been discussion about that. One of the things that is in Indiana law is the ability for a grower to remain confidential. And so we are working through that. And if people choose to be recognized as a confidential site, then that site would not be published.
Where do you take samples on the plants currently?
We typically take the top 2 inches. So we are very much into the bud sampling. We have done for fiber, we've done leaf samples as a corollary test. So we have done those differently. And again, we're trying different methods. Where are we?
Do you have a recommended strain to grow or stay under that THC level?
I do not have a recommendation at this point. I think once we get the document out, just kind of showing the performance, you can see what those are. But no, we don't have a recommended variety right now.
Thank you.
Yes.
The testing, can a farmer test his own THC, or how does that work as far as, you say, be careful?
Yes, very much. Yes, that should be a part of your normal business plan or growing plan. Is that you're out there testing, and your contractor may in fact have requirements that you do certain testing over certain periods of time. That may be very much a thing. But you will need then to locate a laboratory who can do the total THC, be competent, and then get you what kind of turnaround you can get. Because you probably will not be drying it down. That takes like 2 weeks to get that done. That's why a lot of the states end up taking so long is the requirement to dry down for those things. You're doing more of a green sample. So yes, you do need to sample. All right.
2 quick questions. One, what percent of total THC is in street marijuana that may be smoked right downtown right now? And 2, what do other states, how are they approaching this that maybe have legalized the growth of marijuana, like Colorado? Are they into extensive testing like this, or is it just wild, wild west?
No, the great question. For the testing of the THC, states are following that, the THC, THCA, they're going that direction. So that's pretty well set. It actually had been set for under the DEA program. Okay, so that's most states are doing that. Not all states, but most states. The second question, though, is a real interesting one. It turns out that it's just like with brassica and canola. You're familiar with those crops? The brassica is a weed, but canola is something. And so you go ahead, they look like the same plant. They've got different genetics for different growing purposes, and you have to test to treat them different. So if you're going to handle canola, you have to have a very clean line there that separates it from the brassica. The same thing with hemp. If you're going to call something hemp, all right, it has to be hemp. It has to meet those criteria. Otherwise, it's marijuana. I mean, that's kind of the box it's in. So, yes, even in Colorado, if you're calling something hemp, it still has to meet the requirements of hemp. Oh, okay.
Are you studying the variations in growing conditions as a factor in the total THC in
it needs to be studied, and I think that's part of what the Purdue Research Program has started. But we aren't anywhere near the end of that yet. And Don, you've got comment?
We are pulling the data that the primary reasons that this research survey that we sent out about a week ago need to be done is we can go back and make preliminary correlations. So if you haven't filled out that, actually it's part of your research agreement. So whether you like to fill it out or not, it's part of your research agreement. But the data will stay confidential. It will be grouped as total overall data. But that's the kind of thing, some of those questions were when did you plant, when did you harvest, did you irrigate, did you not irrigate, what was your fertilizer program? So we can do preliminary work. It's definitely not grad student level, but we can do preliminary work based upon that survey.
All right, thank you.
We've got one last one.
Okay, one more, all right. Yes.
So this is regarding taking samples of the crop. So working in a processing facility, eventually the biomass is going to be ground up into more of a homogenized sample. But we're taking a sample upon intake. And when you say you take like the first, or the top 2 inches, are you including leaves or like a branch in that? Just knowing that like having some stem or whatever is going to cut down the total percentage. I'm just wondering, is the sample that you take, should it include that branch or sorry, that stem or no?
We're taking basically the top 2 inches, homogenizing it, like you say, and homogenization is a really important step to make sure it's a uniform sample when you go through, and we consolidate the buds. So we actually have been doing 30 buds in a variety, all right? Pulling those together into one sample, homogenizing that, and then running a test on that. So you get a broad spectrum of what's in the field.
Okay, so you're separating the bud from the stem that is growing?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.